Welcome to the Celebrate Moral Exemplars Podcast with Dan Osborne. We think of moral exemplars as ordinary people who have the moral will to do the right thing to improve the lives of others. They often do this by using their creativity, wisdom, and judgment to challenge rules and accepted practices. Each episode will provide you with insights into the motivations, sacrifices, and rewards that these amazing people experience. We also hope to plant a seed in your own mind and heart to perhaps consider one day, and in your own way, following the path of these moral exemplars. Now, here's Dan Osborne.
So my interviewee today currently lives in Wellington, New Zealand. And full disclosure here, this gentleman has been a friend of mine since we met on a motorcycle tour of Tasmania, Australia, back in January of 2015. And in August of 2016, we actually rode motorcycles together with 5 other friends across the Himalayan mountains in northern India on some of the highest and, it has to be said, most dangerous roads in the world. And several years ago, he went through a rigorous interviewing process and was selected to join an international humanitarian non-governmental organization known as Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, or Doctors Without Borders. And I'm really looking forward to sharing his story with you today. He's one of the most sincere, intelligent, and humble people I've ever met. In fact, I suspect it'll be a challenge to get him to talk about himself, as that's not really his style, but I'm going to try very hard. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast, Shaun Cornelius. Good day, Shaun.
Hi, Dan. Good to speak to you. Thanks for that introduction.
You're very welcome. Nice to have you with us, and looking forward to having a chat about some of your experiences with MSF. And I know it's been an interesting journey for you, and I thank you for your willingness to come on board here and talk with us. Let's just start off, Shaun, if we could. Tell us a little bit about your professional career and the specific skills that you felt that you'd sort of developed over that time, and how you sort of applied them in your career. In other words, in general terms, what have you sort of done in your career? And if you could maybe give us a little background on that, that's okay.
Yeah, I've probably got a fairly unusual background career-wise in that I did an apprenticeship right from early days. I wasn't really very good academically. I didn't fit in too well with the school system, so left school without a lot of qualifications, took an apprenticeship as a diesel mechanic working on railway locomotives in New Zealand. Very soon, though, I moved through that and actually got into the aircraft industry in New Zealand. Worked as an aircraft technician, became a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer, and sort of moved up through that industry and worked for the national airline in New Zealand and some airlines overseas, worked on helicopters and stuff. And then when I was in my 20s, I started to get a little bit bored with working as a technician, and but very interested and passionate about engineering and machinery and stuff like that. So I decided I wanted to go to university, and so I started studying part-time, and eventually did 2 years full-time to finish off my engineering degree. And by that time, I was about 30, and I had a couple of children by then. And then upon finishing my degree, I started working for the main electricity utility in New Zealand. So this is a company that generates and distributes electricity. And I've actually been in the electricity industry, or I was in the electricity industry ever since then. So from then on, I worked pretty much as an engineer doing maintenance, and then later design work to do with power generation and distribution. I became progressively less interested in the technical side and more interested in the commercial side and the development side, how to get projects off the ground, get things moving, running teams of people.
So you started to just focus a little bit more on the bottom line sort of stuff.
Exactly, yeah. I did a lot of financial analysis. I did some financial papers at university. Eventually, I did an MBA in order to broaden my general skills in business and finance and marketing and all those sorts of things. And so then I continued to move up through the industry and became responsible for managing a number of major development and construction projects, mostly to do with, in the later years, with renewable energy, wind farms and solar projects and so on.
That would have been interesting, kind of cutting edge stuff at the time, I guess.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and it felt really good. It's really satisfying. Working on renewable energy has a real good sort of feel-good factor to it. So that was all good. And then as I got older and it started to become a bit same. So I was kind of doing the same kind of projects over again, just in different places. And I started to think that maybe I'd like to do something completely different, and particularly to get out of the corporate environment and experience a different type of organisation. At the same time, I got to a point in life where I suddenly realised I actually had choices that I didn't have before, really. So my children had all left school, finished their education, left home. They were independent. They weren't relying on us for support anymore. The mortgage was paid off, so I didn't actually really need a full-time job with a big salary anymore.
So vistas were starting to open up for you there.
Exactly, yeah. So I could have just carried on doing what I was doing, but I actually reached a point where I'd finished a major project and I had the choice of starting again on something else, but I decided to just bail out, really. And I took a couple of years working part-time as a consultant contractor within the same industry, but working more on small aid-funded projects around the Pacific. So again, that was a bit different. And at that time, I also got involved working for Red Cross in New Zealand, doing volunteer work with refugee resettlement. But all the time, I had my eye on Médecins Sans Frontières. I'd always been a very keen follower of international affairs, geopolitics, and so on. And MSF's name kept cropping up whenever there was some major disaster, conflict, whatever going on. And I formed this idea that they were an organisation I would really like to work for at some point. So 2014, I actually made the step, applied to them, went through the recruitment process, got selected, and started work with them as a logistician.
So can I just interrupt you for a moment? Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the process? Not in too much detail, but just an overview of the process that you went through to be selected by MSF?
Yeah, I mean, basically you go to their website and there's a self-assessment thing you can do there, which helps to see if you've got the right attributes.
What do you think they were getting at with those questions? What type of attributes do you think they were sort of trying to get to?
Right, it's pretty clear. I mean, and this comes out during the interview process as well, which is largely not technical focused. It's probably different if you're a surgeon. They want to know that you actually know how to sew people back together. But for other roles, it's really focused around your personal attributes and emotional maturity, resilience, and those kind of things. So what they look for is experience of working in remote locations, independent travel, like backpacking around in third world countries, figuring out things as you go, outdoor adventure activities, ability to work in cross-cultural teams, all those sorts of things. Yeah.
That would have been interesting. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. I think that gives us a pretty good idea of what that was like. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've completed how many assignments with MSF now?
I've done 3. So I'm about to go off.
Just give us a little brief overview of each one of them.
My job is logistician. Then, people think Médecins Sans Frontières, that it's all doctors and nurses and medical people, but it's not the case at all. It's about 50% medical, 50% non-medical. Okay. So to get medical teams into the places they need to be, then it takes a lot of technical and logistical and administrative and finance and all sorts of things to get them there.
So it's a multidisciplinary type of operation, isn't it?
Yeah, so the logisticians pretty much do everything that the medics don't do. So the medics do medicine, logisticians do everything else. So the first project I was involved in was in South Sudan. So South Sudan was in the middle of a civil war then, and it still is. It's ongoing. It's one of the most disastrous places in the world, really, in terms of total collapse of government and healthcare and everything else. So I was working in a refugee camp situation. Well, technically speaking, they weren't refugees. They were IDPs, which is internally displaced people.
So they come from within the country, meaning that is that right? Okay.
Yes, that's the distinction.
And was it a particularly violent sort of situation?
Yes, yeah. The people in the camp were fleeing from the government troops. So the civil war was on ethnic lines. There was Nuer and Dinka people. The people that were in the camp were predominantly Nuer, who are the minority rebel group that had split away from the predominantly Dinka government. And the government troops were busy hounding down the Nuer group, and in order to remove support for the rebels, they basically using a scorched earth policy of burning villages, chasing people out, shooting people, raping the woman, and so on, and denying people health care and access to food and so on. So it's pretty straightforward kind of genocide type situation.
Pretty traumatic, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So that was South Sudan, and what was the next one after that?
Ethiopia, which was related to the same conflict. Ethiopia borders South Sudan, and there's a lot of people pouring out of South Sudan into Ethiopia to try and escape from the conflict, and there's refugee camps set up there, and again MSF was operating emergency hospitals and so on in those refugee camps. So I was working there, and my role was on that particular project, my role was to get a new hospital, or to be part of the team anyway that was getting a new hospital up and running. So my job was to get all the power systems and water and sanitation, biomedical systems, telecommunications, and everything else up and running.
That sounds like it would have been quite daunting in that sort of environment, really.
Can be, yeah. I mean, it's usually you're working with very limited resources, limited materials, and very low skill base for the local people, and so it's pretty hard to get things done. It's not like you can't go down the road to Bunnings and get a new drill bit for or whatever. It's So
that was Ethiopia, and then your third assignment has been.
It was in the Mediterranean. So as a lot of people will be aware, there's refugee migration crisis going on in Europe for the last couple of years, with people flooding out of, firstly from the Middle East, from Iraq and Syria, escaping from the chain of conflicts that have occurred there. And then more recently, there's been people escaping from sub-Saharan Africa and moving up through people smuggling routes up through Niger and to Libya, and then getting into boats and trying to get across the Mediterranean to Italy and Greece. And lots of people drowning in the ocean, and so there's been a bit of a international response to try and deal with that, and MSF has 3 ships operating in the Mediterranean doing search and rescue, and I was working on one of those ships.
I see. And what sort of, just to give us some flavor of the flow of people, of humanity that was coming out of there, can you give us some insight there?
Yeah, I mean, the area I was working in is the Western Mediterranean. So this is the piece of the Mediterranean that to the south borders Libya and Tunisia, and then people are heading straight north from there up towards Sicily and Italy. And in that zone, last year there was about 185,000 people made the journey across.
Wow. In just 12 months?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And were you seeing that sort of like hundreds of people every day?
Yeah, I mean, we would basically head down to the coast of Libya and patrol and pick up boats, and we could carry a maximum of up to 700 people, and we would fill the boat up within 3 days usually, and there was probably at least 5 other vessels operating down there that were experiencing similar loads.
Just let me ask you this. The people that you rescued them, were they glad to be rescued, or were they disappointed that I guess they knew they were not going to make it to where they wanted to go to? So did you normally find that they were angry or disappointed about being picked up, or are they quite the opposite?
They're extremely happy to be picked up because most of them are in pretty bad shape. The boats are barely afloat. In most cases, the boats have no chance at all of getting to Italy. It's about 500 kilometres across there. Okay. We were picking them up.
So by that time, they'd kind of given up all hope of being able to make it.
Yeah. If they weren't picked up, they would have drowned, that's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Amazing stuff. Yeah, I can hardly imagine what that would, just several hundred people a day, really almost on the verge of death, really on death's door.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
You're listening to the Celebrate Moral Exemplars podcast. Each episode gives you a rare opportunity to look inside the hearts and minds of people who are committed to improving the lives of others. Our intention is to plant a seed in your mind, a seed that may grow one day and cause you to want to emulate, in your own way, the path taken by these moral exemplars. Contact information regarding this episode's guest can be found on our website at www.celebratemoralexemplars.com. And now, back to the interview.
So how do you feel like working with MSF over the last period has sort of affected your life now that you come back and sort of digest a little bit? What are some of the takeaways for you in your experience up to this point with them? How has it affected your life, do you feel?
Well, I'm kind of totally immersed in the whole humanitarian world, I guess. So, I mean, I read a lot more about what's happening in the different locations and different crises that are happening around the world. I keep up to date with all that. I take very strong interest in politics that affect these situations and cause these situations. Yeah, I have an interest in the higher level overview as well as the on the ground stuff. And I guess because I know what it's actually like right on the ground, it's all very real for me. Whereas I guess previously I was like most other people. You read about this stuff in the paper, but you don't really have any appreciation of what's actually happening. And it's hard to visualize it. And also, you know, you think, well, what can I do about it? But you kind of can't do anything much about it other than maybe donate some money. But now that I'm part of Médecins Sans Frontières, it's quite different because now I think, well, yes, I can do something about it. All I've got to do is call up MSF and say I'm available, and they'll have me somewhere in the world within a couple of weeks. So, you know, it's now quite a different situation.
Right. Would it be accurate to say you sort of feel more empowered by the opportunity they've given you?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I also get involved a lot in trying to raise other people's awareness as well. So I've done quite a bit of speaking in New Zealand and blogs on the internet and stuff. Just and what's trying to get the message out.
And so what is the main, when you try to raise awareness, maybe because obviously this is an opportunity to do that for our listeners here, just briefly, what would be the synopsis of your message in that respect when you go forth and do that sort of activity? Yeah,
I mean, I think people just need to take an interest and be aware of what's going on around the world, because it's pretty tragic, many of the situations around the world. And even if all you can do is donate some money, then that's really good. Or if you can get involved in supporting organisations in some other way, then it's really good. Trying to support the political parties that have the most supportive policies and things like that, and understanding the issues and taking a view, I guess, is important.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Actually, I was just going to ask you now, with your experience on it, if you think back on it, what do you feel is sort of your particular story you might share with us that gave you a great sense of accomplishment? It might have been just a very short in time frame or whatever, but I thought it might be interesting for us to hear about something that particularly stands out in your mind as giving you a great sense of accomplishment with respect to your role.
The greatest thing is really just being part of the team. So as a logistician, your job is to keep everything working. So when you're successful, it simply means that everything works as it should and nothing turns to custard and turns into a disaster. So it's not like being a surgeon where you stitch together somebody that's stood on a landmine or something or other, in which case you can point to that specific thing you saved. In my case, it's more a matter of making sure that everything works, and effectively the people don't even know you're there because everything kind of works. But that said, you know, there is some things which are very satisfying if you get something like a water system or electric power system, when you get it up and running, get everything working, power's on, the generators are running, and everything works smoothly for the first time. Those sorts of things are pretty satisfying. Or you get a water treatment plant running and you're supplying water to people who would otherwise not have any water, get food distribution working and you see people actually getting food, all those sorts of things. Pretty satisfying.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, thank you for that. That's interesting, very much. I think kind of start to wrap up here a little bit, but it's been fascinating to hear about your experiences on that, and I appreciate you sharing. But before we do wrap up, is there any particular advice that you might share with someone who might be considering following a similar path with respect to contributing to other people's lives?
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly satisfying, and I think there's been a number of studies that show that one of the best things you can do for your own personal well-being is helping other people. So it's certainly good for yourself, right. I think. And so, that's part of, I don't do this work just because it helps other people. I do it because, you get to work in some interesting places. You get to work with some amazing people, great teams, and you experience things and see things which you would never, ever experience in normal life. And some of these things are confronting and challenging, but, you're alive when you're dealing with this kind of stuff. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
It's like, and the emotional intensity is very high. So 3 months in an emergency hospital is, in terms of emotional intensity, is like 5 years of normal life. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Well, Shaun, I'd just like to wrap it up here. I want to thank you for your openness and your willingness to share your experiences today. It's been great. And for those of you who have any questions or comments for Shaun, he's requested that you contact him via our website at celebratemoralexemplars.com and via the episode's show notes. Shaun, thanks again for being on the podcast. I found your story really inspirational, and I'm sure many of our listeners are going to feel the same way. I look forward to the next time that we meet, and I hope it's again on a motorcycle in a remote part of the world.
Hey, thanks very much for the opportunity, Dan. I'm not sure that I'm really a moral exemplar. I think I'm really just a guy doing something that I really like doing and that I get a lot out of. But hey, that's okay. And look, if anybody's interested in learning more about MSF, just go to the MSF Australia website, and there's heaps of information on there. So again, thanks very much, Dan, and I really look forward to catching up with you again sometime in the near future.
Okay, take care, my friend.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrate Moral Exemplars podcast with Dan Osborne. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, he would love to hear from you. Also, Dan is currently seeking moral exemplars to interview for future podcast episodes. So if you know such a person and would like to see their work acknowledged and promoted, please contact him via the website at www.celebratemoralexemplars.com. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.